we're going to turn the program over to Mr. Tony Jablonski. He's our Senior Manager of RAM, Risk Analysis and Mitigation, and he's going to talk to you about a very, very important report that comes out every year around this time. It's called the CMEP Implementation Plan. And if you don't know what CMEP means or you don't know what the implementation plan, you are in the right place because Tony's going to break this down for us. Tony, are you there?
Thank you, Brian. Can you hear me?
I can hear you and I can see you. The floor is all yours.
Outstanding. So good afternoon, everybody. Like Brian said, my name is Anthony Jablonski. I'm the Senior Manager of our Risk Analysis Mitigation Group. We also have registration in our group. So if you have, after this show, if you have registration questions, you have my contact info at the back end of this. So today I will be talking about the 2026 Compliance Monitoring and Enforcement Program Implementation Plan. So throughout this presentation, I will be noting that as the CMEP IP. Okay, next slide, please. So today I'll be covering, the CMEP IP, the purpose, why do we do it, what's it all about, the inputs that go into it, and then the changes. The changes are really because, what I want to talk about is we've been doing this annually for a number of years, putting out this report. So there's changes from time to time, from year to year. So we'll have a slide that I'll be talking about the changes between 2025 and the new 2026 IP. Next slide, please. So the purpose, so the CMEP IP is an annual roadmap for compliance monitoring and enforcement for planning purposes, right? On the risks amongst the ERO, right? This is something that it's developed by the regions. All 6 of the regions have direct input into it. There's a task force, and then NERC as well, right? So NERC, the regions, we get together, we review a number of inputs that I'll discuss in the next slide, and we go through and develop the risk elements. Okay, and the risk elements are basically the risks we are seeing for the upcoming year, the highest areas of risks, right? The areas of focus. Now, I do want to kind of pause for a second because within the ERO, there's a lot of risk terms out there. There's tons of them, but there's 3 that, I constantly hear people getting confused about. So risk elements are associated with the CMEP IP that I'm talking about today. We have things called risk categories. Risk categories are associated with entity compliance oversight plans. Okay, those are individual risks for individual entity by entity basis. So entity A will have a risk category where regions find, hey, these are the risks for that specific entity for their upcoming kind of audit schedule. And then there's also things called risk factors, and risk factors are associated with, once again, individual entities' inherent risk. Risk factors are the pieces, the criteria that make up an inherent risk assessment. So that's a little extra information. So you're for the gift that keeps on giving about risk. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there's a number of inputs that go into the CMEP IP, and 2 big ones are the State of Reliability Report, which is basically a report that comes out yearly. I think it came out maybe last month, but it looks like what it does. It looks at previous years, previous year events, and it draws objective conclusions about the events, emerging risks, and appropriate monitoring strategies and potential mitigations for those. Okay. We also have a reliability risk priorities report, and that's developed by the stakeholder group. It's the Reliability Issues Steering Committee. It's the risk group, and they're basically looking at scenarios of risk over the next 10 years. Okay, so we use those inputs. We also use, like Tim mentioned a little bit ago, there's a long-term reliability assessment, LTRA. There's an ERO strategic plan. There's events that go on throughout the years that we compile, and compliance findings. Right, we have a wealth of information on compliance findings information. Okay, next slide, please. So on this slide, I'm going to go through, like I mentioned, what's new for 2026, what changed, what's going on. And we'll start off facility ratings, remote connectivity. There's no changes. Those remain on. They remain the highest areas of risk for the upcoming year. So they remain the same. Supply chain, that one stays, but we are adding CIP 13R1 and CIP 7R2. So basically supply chain risk management and the recovery plans for BES systems are being added, and CIP 13R2 is being removed. Okay. Physical security, that remains, but we are adding CIP 6R1. That's physical security of BES cyber systems. And the next two, we have in 2025, we had a transmission planning and modeling risk element, and then also an inverter-based resources, IBRs. They're not going away, but they're being combined into one, and it's a new risk element called grid transformation. And that's also looking at some other stuff. I'll talk about that more in depth as we go throughout the presentation. So not going away, being combined, moved to a new grid transformation risk element. The next one is extreme weather response. Once again, this one, there's extreme weather out there, and what it's including is some of the changes. There's a new version of EOP 12-3. It's the cold weather preparedness standard operations, and that just recently went into effect. So that's coming down the pike, and then we also added FAC 3-5R6, and that's vegetation management. Incidents response, that was in 2025. That is being removed, and basically we're seeing what we saw last year, that risk is remaining stable, and it's kind of teetering on the lower side. So I'm not saying it's still not a risk, it just doesn't rise to the highest echelon of risks to be considered a risk element. And then, like I said before, we have a new risk element called grid transformation. I'll be talking about that in a little bit. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through some of these a little more detail. So facility ratings, like I said, no change, but this is, facility ratings are important, right? I mean, it continues to be a risk because it's so fundamental to what we all do, right? From an operations planning perspective, if you don't have the facility ratings correct, there's issues. So we continue to see that as an issue, as a risk. So this stayed on, and primarily it's FAC 8, R6 that we're concerned about. Next slide, please. Remote connectivity, similar to facility ratings, stays the same. No changes, but this is really, it's covering, that risk between communications amongst, control centers and security management controls, right? It's very important that we don't have, bad actors getting into our control rooms, getting into the data, getting into the control information we have. Okay, next slide, please. Supply chain, a few changes. Like I said, CIP 13R2 was removed, but it was replaced by CIP 13R1. We added CIP 7R2, and supply chains, there's a lot of new generation out there, a lot of wind, solar, and there's supply chain, disruption out there. It's being constrained, right? So it's still an area of risk. It's still very important. It's addressing that risk of vulnerabilities of the new digitalized world we live in. There's global supply chain disruption, and there's cyber attacks. So another, like I said, very important, and this is it remains the same as a 2026 risk element. Next slide. Physical security. This addresses that risk of frequency of physical security incidents causing operational impacts that continue to remain consistent. So the changes here, we added CIP 6-6 requirement 1. Next slide. Extreme weather. I'm sitting here and just over the weekend, I was watching a great football game. I'm a big Chicago Bears fan. But I'm watching this game and it's freezing outside. I'm from Chicago, and they flashed on the screen that it was 1 degree out. And I think they said it was one of the coldest games played at Soldiers Field in recent history. And also in my mind is that concern that I always have, we all have, is cold weather preparedness for generators, right? Generators not being able to start up when it gets that extreme cold, weather. So so that EOP 12-3, the new version that's out there, we added FAC 3, which is vegetation management. But we have to remember this extreme weather response risk element. It's not just talking about the cold weather, right? There's things like hurricanes that cause disruption out there, wildfires, etc. There's a bunch of extreme weather out there that we have to account for, and they're becoming bigger and bigger risks as we move forward. Next slide, please. And here's the new one. Like I said, it's new, but it's not necessarily new. But this new grid transformation risk element, it covers the inverter-based resource, because like I said, they're popping up everywhere. And there's even new rules of procedure where we have these category 2s out there that don't even, they're not even considered BES, but there's the voltage and frequency fluctuations that they could cause in aggregate are massive. So there's standards out there for them. So and also the transmission planning and modeling piece. Once again, it's so important that the large loads that Tim talked about, all that information, we need to have that from a planning and modeling perspective. So this one, like, as I mentioned a little bit, there's the resource adequacy piece. Tim was talking about it. It's a big risk. Workforce adequacy. There's you need to train people because the workforce is getting older. People are retiring. Interconnections modeling, we talked about that, and aggregation control, right? We have these wind farms, solar farms, they're being operated out of like a single control center, like the aggregate of impact. So lots of things going on. So that this, once again, like I said, it made sense to have a grid transformation risk element, and they lumped them all together. So some of the changes outside of the other changes that I talked about, CIP2 was added. And this is really kind of categorizing BES cyber systems, right? We all know CIP2, that's a fundamental CIP standard, and you're putting your assets and making them high, medium, or low, right? Doing that analysis, figuring out what they are. CIP4 -7, personnel and training mandates, personnel risk assessments, training. Once again, that's covering that workforce adequacy type issue. And then CIP 11, talking about information protection, that was added as well. Next slide. All right, so this is just, I believe these slides are going to be made available after the fact. So here's just a couple of the big things I talked about. Obviously the CMEP IP, that was the show today. That's there, the link for you, for all to take a look at. I highly encourage all of you to take a look at it, read it. But like I said, there's the ERO Reliability Risk Priorities Report out there, good reading, along with the State of Reliabilities Report. Next slide. So with that, there's my information, my email address, my direct phone number. If you have any questions, feel free to give me a call, send me an email outside of this. I'll get you the answers the best of my ability. And with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Brian.
Tony, I was going to give you a candy cane as well until you brought up the Chicago
Don't
Bears beating up on the Cleveland Browns. So you just had to go there, didn't you?
I was going to wear my Bears hat and everything, but I had to be a little professional. So sorry, Brian.
Just a little bit. Thank you for coming on the program. Thanks for sharing the CMEP IP with us. Important document, prioritize our risks throughout the year. I actually put in the Slido, just, Tony did a long dissertation about risk factors, risk categories, and risk elements. I feel like that could be your doctorate. We could call you Dr. Jablonski, and that could be like your whole doctorate is what is the different risk things. But we do have a question that came in, and it's kind of it's an easy one of, all right, so we got this CMEP IP. How do the regions use it?
Awesome question, Brian. There's lots of ways we use it, but two primary ones that come off the top of my head is I talked about the compliance oversight plan, right? So we use it when, and that's my space, right? I deal with the risk side. We'll use that as an input when we're trying to identify, specific areas of concern, issues, or highest risk areas for individual entities. It's a starting point, because for 2026, these are the ones that were across the region. They're probably applicable to to the individual entities. But I do always want to bring out that just because it's a risk element or there's a standard areas of focus within the IP doesn't always necessarily mean it's going to land up on audit schedule. And conversely, if it's in the IP, it doesn't necessarily, or if it's not in the IP, it won't be in your upcoming audit schedule either. Reason being, there may be specific risk for a specific entity because of other factors, like maybe old recent compliance history that they had to fall down in assisted protection, and PRC 5 is still an area of something we want to look at. Right, so like I said, the one reason we use this CMEP IP from a regional side is to help out with the compliance oversight plan and identifying areas of risk across, for individual entities, scoping, and then the last thing, not even the last thing, we probably use it a lot more other ways, but we do education, right? We'll take a look at these, and some of them we'll figure out. Brian will probably talk about a couple of these, next year. These are the areas that we find the biggest risk. So let's inform. Let's do a deep dive to help everyone out, understanding the risks on a more on a better basis, and then understanding how to mitigate these risks. So great question, Brian.
Thanks, Tony, and you're spot on. So yes, my compliance friends, this will be an input for them, but it's also an input for me. So as Michelle and Courtney and I are coming up with tech talk topics, we keep in mind things like our regional risk assessment, and of course the CMEP IP, to make sure that if these are the top risks, these are the things we're covering at the summit, at the tech talk, all of those types of things. So Tony, your answer actually kind of went right into the next question, and I think it was kind of wishful thinking, but I said, are the standards associated with the risk elements, are these the only standards we're going to focus on?
Yeah, like I mentioned, they're not. I encourage these are the biggest risks across the ERO, but some risks are not really. There may be risks up. And I'll just use an example, like in upper California, there's a risk of something. Extreme. Maybe the wildfires. But then in southern, well, it's maybe the same risk, but maybe the risk of cold weather is not, right? It's pretty typically warm over there. So it doesn't necessarily mean that these standards are the only standards, by no means. We always encourage everyone, do your own risk assessment, but use this CMEP IP as a starting point to start looking.